Hi, I'm Whitney Espich, the CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I hope you enjoy this digital production created for alumni and friends like you.
Hi, welcome to the fifth series of webinars that bring together a diverse set of experts to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on various fields. My name is Erekat, and I'm a member of the MIT Arab Alumni Association, which was established to connect MIT Arab alumni across the globe and bring Arab talents to MIT. Before we begin today's webinar, I would like to take a moment to express our solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and with our Black brothers and sisters around the globe in their struggle for justice. And as part of the MIT Arab Alumni Association commitment for justice and equality, we have organized a special webinar series around racial justice in the Arab world, which will take place this Friday, June 12th at 1 p.m. EDT or 8 p.m. KSA time. Please mark your calendars for a talk with Rana Abdelhamid, an internationally acclaimed community organizer and founder of Malika, and Khalid al-Bayh, a Sudanese artist and political cartoonist, to discuss how Arabs around the world can come to terms with injustice and what tangible steps we can take to support racial equality in our societies. The webinar will be moderated by current MIT undergraduate student, Dina Atiyah, class of 2022. In today's series, Inequality and Social Justice in the Time of COVID-19, we will be discussing the impact of COVID-19 on already vulnerable populations in the Arab world, especially women, refugees, informal migrants, and migrant workers, and how best to move forward. The webinar will be 1 hour long. I will start by introducing our speakers, followed by a brief opening remark by each speaker. Next, I will pose some questions for the speakers to address. And finally, we will have a question and answer session from the audience towards the end. Please write your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, as this is a no voice participation. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Joining us from Lebanon is Dr. Maha Yahya, who is the director of the Carnegie Middle East Center, where she focuses her work on political violence, identity politics, inequality, citizenship, and the refugee crisis. An MIT alum herself, Dr. Yahya has a PhD from MIT and a PhD from the Architectural Association in London. She has consulted with a number of international organizations on a range of issues in Lebanon, Pakistan, Oman, Egypt, and Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Dr. Yahya is also the author of several publications, including most recently, What Syrian Refugees Need to Return Home. From Egypt, we are joined by Mohamed Dahshan, the managing director of OXCON, a development consulting firm advising governments and international organizations on Africa and the Middle East. Mohamed is a fellow with the Chatham House in London, as well as the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy in Washington, DC. He previously advised the African Development Bank and was a consultant for the United Nations Development Program in Jerusalem. Mohamed is an award-winning author and columnist and was listed among the 100 African Future Economic Leaders by the Institute Choiseul. He holds a master's degree from Harvard, a master's degree from Oxford, and a master's degree from Sciences Po Paris. A very warm welcome to both of our speakers today, and thank you for joining us. We will start with Dr. Maha with opening remarks about your work, Dr. Maha, and your expertise on COVID-19 and its impact on inequality in the region. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dana. It's absolutely wonderful to be with you here today. And let's do the Maha rather than the Dr. Maha. Let's just, this is a discussion amongst friends. You asked me to give it some opening remarks, describing a bit the work we do at Carnegie, and then maybe zoom in a little bit on the question of social justice and inequality. Basically, Carnegie, as you know, is a think tank. What we mainly focus on are regional challenges. We are one of 5 regional centers. Ours is based in Beirut, and we cover all of the Middle East. There are others in Brussels and Moscow and other capitals around the world. Basically, what we focus on collectively is the idea that the foundations today, I mean, what we're focusing on today, is that the foundations of the old system, the old governance system in this region have all really been profoundly shaken. Whether it's oil supplies, whether it's authoritarian bargains, whether it's the certainty of resources, economic stability, etc. So the idea is that today we're at a stage where this region must reinvent itself. So what we're trying to focus on now is, what does that mean, literally? Perhaps the cachet of Carnegie in particular is that governance issues, we focus on governance and conflict, obviously. Governance issues are usually a top-down process of political and social decision-making. That's usually the way they're looked at. We're trying at Carnegie also to focus on individuals, on society. So trying to look at issues from the bottom up, not just from the top down. And this is mainly through scholars who are based in the region, who are from the region. Most of our scholars are really across this region. It's also about encouraging knowledge production from the region to the region. Now, in terms of my own work, I've been focusing for the last few years specifically on, obviously, the question of the refugee crisis, issues around social justice, inequality, and political violence, specifically when it pertains to identity politics. And I think there's perhaps Lebanon is one place where this is the most visible, given the complexity of the social makeup in this country, and we can talk about this later. But we're also seeing the heavy price that the whole region is paying for what I think fundamentally are questions of political and economic mismanagement, not to mention repression. This is a region that today is dealing with a number of protracted conflicts, has one of the largest, it's a region that constitutes 5% of the global population, and yet more than 50% of the world refugees come from our region. They come from Arab countries. Syria alone, there are about 6 million refugees, 5 to 6 million refugees, and another maybe 6.7 million internally displaced. I'll stop right here, and I'm sure we're going to get more into the weeds of what are the issues we're focusing on. We look a lot on, we've been focusing, actually our most latest publication was on contentious politics in Syria. So it is a process of both bottom up and top down.
Great, thank you very much, Maha. I will come back to your remarks in the discussion segment, and especially in regards to the refugees. We'd like to hear more about that. For now, let's turn to Mohamed from Egypt. Mohamed, if you can tell us a bit about your work and about inequality, especially in conflict zones, and the work that is being done to address the impact of COVID-19.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thanks to the MIT Alumni Association for inviting someone from that other school across the city. Very grateful to be here. So I work for a company called OXCON Consulting, which is an advisory firm that works with governments and international organizations primarily. I would try to advise them on designing economic development policies in the various countries that they work in around the world. We tend to focus on Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. And we have a particular interest in fragile and post-conflict countries because we tend to think that they represent a particular challenge that deserves a lot of attention. And in the Middle East in particular, this is definitely not something we have the shortage of. And I'll gladly circle back to this a little bit. So in addition to my work at OXCON, I also have the pleasure of working with think tanks where we research things like regional integration, social safety nets, and so on and so forth. There's a number of economic and social issues in the Middle East that we focus on. So I'll actually try to bring in some of the work that we've done in that discussion. But this is actually a really good segue to sort of set the stage for what we're looking at. Now, over the last few months, of course, unsurprisingly, we've all been focused on the impact of COVID-19 and the response to it, right? And in this region that we're in, it's quite obvious that not that there's a good time for a pandemic to hit, but for many countries, that is probably, it's kind of hitting them at the lowest, right? The Middle East, as we look at right now, the Arab world is a region where 41% of the population are poor, 25% of the population are vulnerable, which is to say that they are sort of they are not below the poverty line, but they would not withstand any kind of shock which would send them below, right? So we're talking 250 million people in the region that simply cannot afford to be hit by such a pandemic, and yet this is what happened, right? At the same time, this is a region that is exceptionally unequal. The top 10% of people in the Arab world account for 64% of the wealth. For comparison, in Western Europe, for instance, the top 10% account for 37% of the wealth. For the Arab world, it's 64. And this inequality, as you mentioned earlier, is something that manifests across various groups. It manifests across gender, it manifests across ethnicity. It is particularly striking for vulnerable populations such as refugees and so on, right? So all that to sort of set the stage for what the countries were dealing with. In addition, there's a number of economic crises too that have been ongoing with last, shall we say, the previous months, the months previous the crisis. So for instance, countries like Algeria has been dealing with the contraction that it had to endure due to the oil crisis that has severely affected its revenues. Egypt was just emerging out of a, shall we say, moderately successful reform plan that was very painful socially, and that in 3 years has sent 5 million people below the poverty line, right? Between 2017 and 2019, 5 million Egyptians went below the poverty line. And of course, as Dr. Maha was saying, Lebanon also has had its own share of crises. I mean, suffice to say that the recovery plan of the government literally begins with the words, the Lebanese economy is in free fall. So that's the stage that we're looking at. I'll probably pause here as well. There are a number of issues that definitely would like to bring up more. Some of the more vulnerable populations, such as the informal sector, as we had been discussing earlier, and what's happening with countries that are in crisis or in conflict. But for now, I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mohamed. I think it's very interesting where you're focusing and you're talking about economic inequality in the Arab world and how that has been exacerbated even with COVID-19. And I think turning back to Maha, it would be good to enable to put this discussion within a framework is, what does inequality and social justice actually mean for the Arab world? Beyond just economic inequality, what are the various issues that are there in the Arab world that are pertinent to achieving justice and equality?
Thank you, Dana. Let's just backtrack for a second and go back to 2011, just for 30 seconds. 2011, we had the Arab uprisings, and fundamentally they were about a demand for social justice, العدالة الاجتماعية والكرامة, dignity. Social justice at the time was looked at as a demand for equity, for equality, and for participation. Arab citizens at that time were living in a region where there was economic growth, but without well-being. So the benefits of macroeconomic growth were really unevenly distributed. And as Mohamed just said, with the result that we had a region, we ended up in a region that has one of the biggest gaps when it comes to inequality. It's a region where we had economic liberalization, but with greater political repression, unlike other regions. And it was a region where people lived lives without dignity. that despite human development improvement, the quality of life, despite gains on health and in education, and we could see it in a lot of the figures at the time that the UN were producing, more and more people were being educated, more and more people were having access to healthcare, etc. But the quality of life was deteriorating, particularly for the middle class. Just one indicator of that was the number of university graduates. 32%, I believe, of university graduates in Tunis at the time did not have jobs, could not access jobs. So they would graduate with a degree from university and end up working as cab drivers or tourist guides because they had no other option. So I think that all of this, I mean, we won't talk about the corruption, state capture, all of these were features of the region at the time. Fast forward to 2020, and the region is unfortunately in a much worse situation than it was 9 years ago. So it's just astonishing. And COVID-19, the pandemic, the lockdown measures associated with COVID-19 highlighted, just brought into much sharper focus these fundamental challenges that were facing this region at the time. So if we're looking at, for example, distance learning, the idea that who could have a distance learning and who couldn't, it was determined by the quality of teachers, the accessibility to the internet, the capacity of mothers to help children with distance learning at home, so on and so forth. Mohamed wants to talk a bit more about the informal sector, so I won't go too much into that. But people working in the informal sector were being asked to stay at home without any kind of social support. And that's one of the biggest issues also that we're dealing with today, is that the systematic withdrawal of states from the provision of services, whether especially in education and in health, and the systematic withdrawal from even basic social protection mechanisms, rendered a lot of citizens in this region vulnerable to any kind of shock. I'll use again Lebanon as an example. In 2014, I believe, one of the last surveys done, almost 1/3 of the population was hovering on or around the poverty line. What this means effectively is that any kind of shock is going to send it below the poverty line. Lebanon today actually is looking at almost 50% of its population having fallen below the poverty line. And there's a massive wealth destruction as a result of the economic crisis. I don't want to focus on Lebanon because Lebanon was already having its own challenges prior to the crisis. But let's go to a place like Syria, for example, countries that are in conflict, Syria, Libya, Yemen. These are places where the health infrastructure was already decimated prior to COVID-19. Lockdown measures come in. The health infrastructure doesn't have the capacity to deliver on the services needed. And actually, a lot of the political characters, the military groups, non-state actors are using the pandemic to either push for political gains or to leverage positions with each other. And we see this across the board, again, without going into too much detail. So to come back to your question, what does social justice mean? And this is at a time when there is an increasing trust gap between citizens and their states. I've already mentioned the issue of the refugees. Poverty rates in the region are almost 4 times higher than previously assumed. This was before the pandemic. So to come back to your question, what does social justice mean for people today? It's not just about making sure they have a basic food basket, which is kind of, lowering the bar to the bare minimum. Yes, today we're seeing levels of hunger that are increasing. A place like Syria, a country like Syria today, close to 80 to 85% of the population is below the poverty line. And actually is now, the UN is starting to issue warnings about a possible famine, malnutrition in Syria. Syria, which used to produce more more food than anywhere else. Yemen, we're already facing a mass humanitarian situation. This is all coming at a time when also because of the impact, the global economic impact of COVID-19, and then the impact on the region in terms of a shrinking fiscal space. The decrease in oil prices means that governments don't have that space anymore to move. Then literally without, it's literally crippling the capacity of states to respond. Civil society is stepping in, but until when? It's not sustainable. To my mind, the only way out of this, and we'll come back if you want in a more detailed discussion at the end of perhaps later on down the road, the only way out of it is with some sort of regional cooperation. The scale of the challenges we're facing today are of such a nature that it's impossible to think of any one country trying to address them in a systematic manner. The ripple effects are region-wide, and these are region-wide challenges. The question is, are the leaders of the Arab countries ready to deal with each other, but even before dealing with each other, are they willing to undertake the kind of reforms needed even within their own countries, understanding that the carrot and stick approach simply doesn't work anymore? They don't have the carrot, the fiscal space is gone, they can't offer people money in return for acquiescence. And quite honestly, the barrier of fear has broken across the region. People are not afraid to, they literally have nothing left to lose in that sense.
Thank you very much, Maha. It's very insightful. And I want to take a step back before looking at regional cooperation to understand from your work has the impact of COVID-19 been different from country to country in the region, or are there more similarities that would require regional cooperation, and how to go about that? And also within that, how are the various social groups impacted? Because we know that in different countries, services for different social groups, vulnerable social groups especially, a lot of times are not provided by the state. Like you mentioned, they are provided by civil society or international organizations. So actually the responsible party is not necessarily one and the same for the various social groups within the system. So it's two questions within one. Is one, what are your thoughts on the impacts in the various countries in the Arab world in terms of how they may be different and how they may be similar? And how are the different social groups within these countries also being impacted? And how does that look as well for if we are to talk about regional cooperation?
Okay. The impact has, we do need to take country contexts to understand the impact. So already the kinds of inequalities we were seeing, and maybe I should have qualified this a little bit earlier, differ from country to country. So whereas in a place like Tunisia, for example, there are fundamental inequalities on every single level, whether it's in access to education, to health, to economic opportunity, any kind of other opportunity, even political opportunity, is very much marked by it's marked, there's a vertical kind of mark between the hinterland, the inland regions, and the coastal regions, where the coastal regions are usually the politically most represented. They are the richest regions. They are the areas where most of the public investment has happened, whereas the internal regions have been neglected for a very long time. And you see actually different economies operating on the hinterland versus the coastal regions. In Lebanon, again, it's a different dynamic. In Jordan, it's a different dynamic. In Lebanon, you do have spatial inequalities where, for example, a region like Akkar is very underserved, and where there is a level of identity politics In Lebanon, actually, for a long time, it played out more in the sense of, if you build a hospital in the south, you've got to build a hospital in the north, just to keep things even, irrespective of whether it was needed or not. So we ended up with over-delivering in some places, under-delivery in others. There was a significant state capture, continues to be a significant state capture, with all the what follows from that in terms of corruption, cronyism, etc. I won't talk about Egypt because I think Mohamed will talk more about Egypt specifically. But needless to say, you will see that from place to place. So the problems prior to the kinds of inequalities we were seeing and the challenges differed from place to place. Because also some of it has to do with how the specificities of one country versus another, the governance structure, the policy choices. For example, Tunisia has a very powerful and strong labor union that, as we know, played an important role in the political transition in 2011. This labor union was able to push for labor rights in ways that is almost non-existent in Lebanon. So these things have an impact at that level. In other places, we've seen identity-related inequalities. So people who come from certain sectarian or ethnic, in Iraq, for example, could possibly have better access than people who come from minorities. So that's another axis where we see certain inequalities play out. This is all to say that when it comes to the impact of COVID-19, all of these cleavages have come into much sharper focus, because if you have access to an educational system, if you live in an area, I mean, there are studies that show if you live in a geographic area where your access to school is very limited, your parents' access to school was very limited, this impacts not only your life today, but it impacts all of your opportunities, and the likelihood of you remaining poor is much larger than getting out of the poverty trap. So if you were already in a situation like this, COVID-19 and lockdown measures came and exacerbated this inability to access a proper educational system. Probably even, having access to a Wi-Fi or a telephone, a smartphone. Teachers who know how to do remote teaching. It's not easy. I've seen this across the region with fundamental challenges on that front. So in that sense, the challenges have differed. Where there have been also significant differences is in the capacity of states to respond. States or countries that have more of a fiscal space, they are able to do, for example, in the UAE, they were able to provide economic stimulus to businesses to continue operating, because there are good businesses that are having to close simply because they're going bankrupt as a result of the closures related to COVID-19, the downturn in consumption, breaking value chain, etc. So other countries like Lebanon, like Jordan, don't have that kind of fiscal space to provide the funding needed. Countries in conflict, it's a different story. And again, I've talked about this briefly in terms of the extent to which countries in conflict, the intersection and the use of actually measures associated with COVID-19 is being used both for politically and military gain. I wrote a piece recently about Syria on that. And actually, we just put out a volume, in fact, on COVID-19 and countries in conflict. In terms of how the impact is playing out on some groups, what we've seen is that, for example, on women, there's been an incredible increase in domestic violence. ESCO put out a report not too long ago. Places even like Lebanon, where the hotline, apparently they're reporting twice as many calls to the hotline. Impact on street children, on refugees who are and internally displaced. Places like Al Hol camp or other camps for internally displaced Syrians. We have very little information in terms of what is going on there. There's very little testing, and there's no real health infrastructure. They don't have the necessary medical equipment even to deal with this. So the impact has been disastrous on refugees, migrant workers. Again, I'll come back to Lebanon. One of the biggest issues over the past few weeks has been with thousands of migrant workers, domestic workers in Lebanon, who all of a sudden, the families they were working for could no longer afford to pay them. So they were left stranded on the street in front of the embassy, waiting to be sent back home through these repatriation flights until an NGO took them in. So I'll stop here and we can get into more details.
Great, thank you very much, Maha, for this. This is a great segue into having Mohamed tell us more about the informal sector in Egypt, how they have been impacted, and also mentioning the ASQA report that was put out. It states that around 62% of the informal sector actually is constituted of women. So how does that look? How does that impact look in Egypt in terms of, and specifically in terms of the impact on women and the overall impact on the informal sector?
Sure. So I'll try to not just focus on Egypt, because actually the informal sector is an issue a little everywhere. And if we are to sort of try to find a framework to understand how countries have been dealing with this crisis, I think part of it would be that we seem to be dealing with the immediate repercussions of the crisis rather than going deeper into what are the fundamental causes behind it. Like, this is how that's like a bit of a common thread really between a lot of the responses that we've seen in the region. So informal work is exceptionally interesting because it's a beast that we know, but don't understand as well as we should, and to a large extent we're not quite sure how to handle. So people working in the informal sector, which is either people working in sort of working on their own as sole operators that are not registered, working for informal economic outfits and companies and firm and factories and whatnot, or people working in registered organizations but without contracts. So these people tend to fall outside all of our already feeble social safety networks, right? But it's such a massive issue. We're talking about basically 2/3 of the workers in countries like Morocco and Egypt, goes up to 71% in Lebanon and 75% in a country like Yemen, and that's pre-war for Yemen, right? So, and the estimates that we have so far is that 80% of the people working in the informal sector across the region have seen their revenue affected, and that has meant two different things. The first one is that sort of our governments have scrambled a little bit to try to put up responses or try to put up support for people working in informally. So countries like Egypt have offered, after putting the bulk of their assistance on the stock market and shoring up large loans, have decided to issue grants that are about $32 a month for 3 months for people who apply for them, for informal sector workers. So below $100 over 3 months. I think Jordan was better. I think their grant was 150 JD, so a little over $200 US, but I think that was a one-off grant. And Iraq, if I'm not mistaken, was I think about $35 as well, something in that vicinity. So that's one thing. So we scrambled a little bit to come up with responses for how to deal with that massive part of our working population. The other problem that we've had is that we have been relentlessly for the last few months talking about how people aren't respecting the social distancing, people aren't respecting curfews, they still insist on going out for work and whatnot. At the same time, we are aware that these are people who sort of depend on their daily wages for their survival. So a lot of countries, Egypt included, have sort of turned a bit of a blind eye on how people have been flaunting all the social distancing and the curfews and whatnot. So Egypt hasn't had a daytime curfew at all in the last 3 months, for instance. We only had nighttime curfews, but daytime work has been going on as usual, which has meant that the crisis will endure, because that will take longer to halt the thing. But there's something else that we don't seem to be realizing, is that we've seen what happens to the informal sector in the Arab world after economic crises, right? We have the experience of 2008, for instance. And we know that what happened in 2008, actually all the way to 2011, if you want to think of that period with the beginning of the Arab Spring and so on, we know what happened is that in a country like Egypt, you had 1.6 million people who are working formally ended up joining the informal sector, right? So what will happen is that the longer this crisis goes, because we are afraid of, because we are unable to actually issue policies and issue the proper amount of support for people working in the informal sector, the longer we allow this crisis to last, will mean that in the longer term, that will have detrimental impacts on the sector itself, because a lot more people will lose their jobs, because people working informally are going to, the factories will close, so these people will start looking for jobs informally and so on, right? So you have a bit of a vicious cycle happening when it comes to dealing with the informal sector. And I think that is definitely something that across all countries is exceptionally poorly dealt with. I wanted also to jump, since you mentioned gender, there's something that's quite important that that receives insufficient support, which is what happens with women with female-headed households. Now, Dr. Maha mentioned gender-based violence, so allow me to complement that by focusing on female-headed households. We are looking at roughly 20% of all households in Morocco, 10% of all households in Palestine, 15% of all households in Egypt are female-headed. And it's important to point out that this certainly underestimates the figures, because the way our statistics are done, if there is an adult male in the family, then we consider him to be the head of the household, as opposed to the woman who would be the primary breadwinner of the family, right? So we are talking roughly 1 out of 6 households, if not significantly more. And this is a segment of society that we have failed to address, we have failed to support. We know that female-headed households have a higher likelihood to be poor. We know that the poor female-headed households are more likely to be severely poor than their male-headed counterparts. And clearly this has been exacerbated by this crisis, and clearly this is something that we have collectively failed to look at. I'll stop here. Hopefully that was a good answer to your question.
No, thank you, Mohamed. That was fantastic. We are a little bit tight on time, but I do want you to also touch on the issues of countries in conflict, countries that are typically more or less off our radar through this pandemic, that we don't, you don't see much about. There isn't much data coming from these countries. So we really don't know what is the impact of COVID-19 that is happening there. Who are the most vulnerable populations? Is it the internally displaced people and refugees? So if we can take it to that, just to give sort of a brief overview to bring to light issues that are happening in conflict zones through this pandemic.
Absolutely. And sort of to illustrate your point about how we're getting no data or no information from these countries, projections for infections in Yemen were projected about 1 million people by the Ministry of Health at the beginning of the crisis. Until today, if I'm not mistaken, like our current day, the government, the Houthi authorities have only announced 4 cases of COVID-19 in the areas under, not 4 million, 4 people is the ones that they have admitted are people who have been infected. even though that we know from reports of the nonprofit sector and activists and whatnot that Yemen is dealing with a really large crisis. But that's just a crazy illustration of how poorly this authority is handling this crisis. But yes, as you said, these countries, we tend to focus, the only news that we get out of them are what's happening with the conflict, right? Which is understandable. Over the past 2 weeks, all we've heard about from Libya was the armed conflict news and like what cities were being attacked and so on and so forth. But we don't actually see what's happening. Pardon me. We don't really know what's happening when it comes to how these countries are dealing with these with the crisis. And one thing that is obvious about these countries is that they are extremely tight on resources, right? You have an average of 14 doctors per 100,000 people in developing countries. In the fragile states or the conflict countries in the Middle East, that's down to 8 doctors per 100,000 people. In a place like Somalia, it's 2 doctors per 100,000 people. In Yemen, 1/5 of all the districts in the country have 0 doctors, right? That's the kind of resource crisis they're looking at. And as Dr. Maha was saying, they also have very few resources to play with. They have very little fiscal space, if I'm going to borrow her term, to provide any type of assistance. Refugee populations also are, as you kindly mentioned, are particularly vulnerable. And as we know, a lot of the countries in conflict or in crisis are the ones that are also host to a lot of refugees and IDPs, whether they're their own IDPs or they're often refugees from neighboring countries, right? And what we know, for instance, is that roughly 80 to 90% of refugees in the Arab world have no access to basic services such as running water. So it's impossible to ask people in such conditions, for instance, to wash their hands all the time. But more interestingly as well, refugees don't have, by mere fact of being refugees, a lot of the things that we use for dealing with crisis are things they have no access to. So we tend to, when in crisis, we usually would ask a friend or family to borrow money, right? The fact that they are outside of their homes, of their home communities, means that even that very important safety net, which is relying on your community, is something that they have no access to. So when a shock hits, it hits them far more violently than it does people who sort of live in their own stable communities. And of course, as Dr. Maha was saying, women refugees are also exceptionally affected by this for a host of reasons. One of them, for instance, that I'll mention is that, and actually that applies to women across the board, not just refugees, the fact that women are the primary caretakers of anyone who requires care makes them significantly more vulnerable to being impacted by crises like this. So that's why, I guess, so if you allow me to disagree a little bit with Dr. Maha on the aspect when it comes to regional cooperation, I'm not entirely sure there is enough, shall we say, similarities or common grounds to develop that type of cooperation when dealing with this crisis. I think there's a lot of cross-learning that is there. There's definitely a lot of especially in countries that have dealt with similar crises, in countries that have gone through conflict and have stabilized. There's a lot of learning to be shared, but I'm not entirely sure what the extent of regional cooperation that can be developed in that case. I think looking at country by country, while giving particular care to fragile states, is probably the way that I would start looking at response to this. There, I thought I put a little bit of a pushback here just to get this discussion going, with your permission, of course. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mohamed, for the information and the data that you shared. It's a lot to think about. It's mind-boggling with the amount of issues that are there in the Arab countries and how they differ. And I want to give the opportunity for Maha to respond to Mohamed and his point about regional cooperation. So what do you think in terms of what he has to say about it?
what I'm trying to say is, or what I was trying to say is that regional cooperation is a must if we are going to address the challenges that this region is facing today. We're looking at a region where the amount of people who are being dislocated, the size of the dislocation, whether it's economic or whether it's physical, people having to leave their homes, is of such a scale that it's almost impossible for any one country to be able to deal with that. This is not, we're not even talking about the reconstruction needs. I won't go into the estimates of the World Bank of what, how many billions of dollars Yemen needs, or Libya needs, or Syria needs, or even Iraq needs. Mosul was literally brought to the ground, at least some parts of it. It's seen significant damage as a result of the fight against ISIS, and yet it has seen very little reconstruction. And this is the major city. We're not talking about the smaller towns and villages. Raqqa was literally decimated, at least some parts of Raqqa, and the attempt to dislodge Daesh from there, the so-called Islamic State. There's been very little reconstruction effort put there. So what I'm saying is that the size of the economic and physical, social dislocation that's happened, it's just impossible. Unless we have a system of regional cooperation where there is a fundamental understanding, and it's underpinned by a fundamental understanding that we need to invest in each other's well-being and each other's, the problems in Lebanon are not going to go away. They're going to impact other places. We're seeing this now in the relationship between Lebanon and Syria. Syria, as an axe of instability in this region, the effect of Syria will not remain in Syria. It's going to impact all of the region. There have been, I won't go into the gazillion of studies which show the benefits of cooperation, whether they're economic or social, whether it's trade or etc. But the bottom line is, what I'm trying to say is that it won't work. If there isn't any kind of regional cooperation to try and address, A, build trust, B, to try and address the challenges that this region is facing today, it will continue to be basically a fundamental, the epicenter of instability, global instability, for a very long time to come. You cannot have prosperity in one part of the region and not in others. And we're not even talking yet about, we haven't mentioned at all the Palestinian issue and what's happening there. I mean, that's been completely surpassed on every fundamental, on every level. So part of it also has to do with justice, but that's a different discussion altogether. This is what I was trying to say. Whether they will take it up and do it, I don't know. And please, let's not talk about reviving the Arab League, because I think that's a non-starter. So I think we need to look at other mechanisms for cooperation and engagement with each other. Right now, Arab countries are playing a very damaging role in each other's affairs. They're not helping each other. They're actually aggravating conflict. Libya and Yemen are just two countries, a case in point, if you like.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maha. It's very interesting to hear about both point of views and how we can move forward, not just from this pandemic, but towards more social justice and towards more equality in the Arab world and in the world as a whole. We do have a few questions from the audience. So I'm going to read some of the selected questions that I will pose. I will start with you, Maha, please. And then if Mohamed has anything to add to these questions. So the first question is, other than the example of Tunisian labor unions being able to address labor rights, are there any other examples of positive change for social justice, whether through reform, new political parties, civil society, or others? And I'm assuming this question is asking broadly, like if there are specific cases in any of the countries that you have experience in.
Yes, I mean, and this is not only post 2011 or post COVID-19. I'll take the example of, for example, the disabled in Lebanon, where literally there was work almost over 20 years to get laws through parliament that recognize their rights. And I mean, it's in legislation, whether it comes to architecture, whether, you know, how you build, being an architect, how you design a space. Doesn't mean it's being implemented, but at least it's now in the text itself. So at that level, you see lots of examples across the board of lobbying attempts to try and make a difference, whether it's for a specific population group or whether it's for a broader cause. But the example of the Tunisian labor union is, I think, very unique in the Arab region in that sense, because it's one of the oldest labor unions. It's very strong, it's well established, and has operated over, you know, decades with relative independence and space. Whereas if you look at labor unions in other parts of the region, many of them ended up being co-opted or undermined by the ruling elite of that particular country. The labor union in Tunis also faces its own challenges. I mean, when the uprising started in 2011, it was actually not the centralized, it wasn't the decision makers at the center who decided to take part in the demonstrations. It was, a lot of it came from the offices in the peripheries, in the other towns. So these things are very dynamic, and you see, and it was actually, and also was the younger crowd who said, you know what, this concerns us. So there was a struggle, in fact, internally, which is rarely talked about, in terms of what role should the labor union play in Tunisia at that particular period of time. And since then, unfortunately, we haven't seen more of this. Maybe I can say, trying to think of one particular example, but nothing comes to mind. Mohamed, maybe you have some.
Thanks, Dr. Maha. Well, definitely, I can definitely think of some. So I mean, two things. One, the example of positive change, let's be honest, every movement that went out on the streets in the last, God knows how many years in this part of the world was actually aiming for positive political change. The fact that some of them failed for a period and then, well, rather, some of them succeeded for a period and then failed. I wish it was the other way around. But in that case, the fact that they succeeded for a brief period and then failed, that doesn't take away from that. But more contemporary examples, I can definitely think of two. Algeria's Haraka movement has been and remains a very interesting source of pressure on the state. And the second thing, which is in Sudan, of course. Now, Sudan, which to some extent the institutional leadership that was sort of the equivalent of the Tunisian labor union, the equivalent of the UGTT, shall we say, in Sudan was تجمع المهنيين السودانيين, the how do you say that? The group of Sudanese professionals, تجمع. Anyways, so تجمع المهنيين sort of fit that leadership position, and perhaps differently from the Tunisian labor union. Dr. Maha, you know better about that, but different from Tunisian labor union, I feel that they provided more of a moral leadership than a technical one. It felt to me that the labor union in Tunisia was more organizing technically. The Association of Sudanese Professionals was more sort of the moral compass of the Sudanese uprising. But these I think are interesting examples. But yes, I think I definitely commend you for bringing up the more limited examples, Kaman, when you talk about reforms are being pushed through parliament and so on. Everything doesn't have to be a revolution. Sometimes revolutions happen on a much smaller scale, as you said. So definitely with you on that.
I concur with his examples. with Mohammed's examples.
I'm glad.
No, they're incredible. Quite honestly, I mean, if you're going to ask me, my hope for this region is coming from the street. I don't think that the political elite today are ready to acknowledge and absorb what needs to be done, because this means change in governance. If you want to achieve social justice for countries of this region, which means social justice means equity, it means equality, and it means participation, i.e. having a voice in how you're governed. These are the lessons of 2011. So, and they continue to be with us. And we're seeing today a much more politicized Arab citizens, whether they're in Saudi Arabia or in Lebanon or in Syria or in Jordan or in Tunis or in Algeria or in Sudan. And before Algeria and Sudan, people were talking about the Arab fall and how, you know, these Arab uprisings ended and they never should have happened and it was all a foreign conspiracy. I mean, it depended who you were talking to. Algeria and Sudan came to say, actually, honey, you know what? No, we're still asking for our freedoms. Lebanon and Iraq, same year, different dynamics. So yeah, my hope is in, I think that's where the change will happen. I think I've preempted some of your questions, maybe.
Yes, thank you very much. It's wonderful. I have one question that is actually a great segue from the previous one, where it says in Arab countries where there is a disconnect between what is needed internally, whether related to equality or justice, and what governments are prioritizing, and where civil society is non-existent. So what mechanisms can be employed to address this gap between what is needed and what is being addressed? And this can also be brought back to the examples that you have brought, Mohamed, forward about the different reform measures that are taking place.
Okay, I mean, short of screaming revolution, I will try to give a partial answer to that, if you'll allow me. I think there's a limit to how much state capture of resources can go on without realizing that their interests and those of the population are necessarily opposed. And there's nowhere where civil society is non-existent. Okay? Civil society is us. We could be unorganized. However, civil society can be unorganized. It can be weak. It can be outlawed. But it is not non-existent. And sort of the fact that many countries have seen mass protest movements that were sort of not disorganized but unorganized. Basically says that in the absence of a functional civil society or of an outlet for people to sort of express their opinion or share their thoughts or try to affect government and government running of affairs, that will have to happen one way or another. I think that, and I'm going to be, so, you know, taking sort of the activist hat off and putting the more practical one on. I think there's a lot of spots where even in dictatorships, where there is room for sort of government resources to go to assisting people and sort of alleviate a lot of the pressures. One of the things that I'm thinking about now, sort of if I'm going to circle back to the main topic of this discussion, is what kind of social safety nets do we need to put in place? For our countries. Now, we know, for instance, that one thing that a lot of countries in the Arab world, democracies be they or dictatorships, have used things like blanket subsidies for food and oil and petrol, right? How do we, and these resources, I think, if I'm not mistaken, we're talking somewhere between 4 and 6% of GDP expenditure across different countries and so on in these type of subsidies. And we know that these subsidies are very poorly targeted, right? Roughly 20%, 25% of the expenditure in subsidies in the Arab world goes to actually the poor people. The rest of it is captured by, you know, people who are the ones who need that assistance. So reforming social safety networks, social safety nets in the Arab world, I think is a key priority. And I think it's definitely something that would be good for people and for government and for budget. So I guess that would be the recommendation I would offer here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohamed. Maha, would you like to add anything?
Not really. I think Mohamed has covered it pretty much. I mean, the ability of people where civil society doesn't exist, create it. I mean, it's civil society is not always necessarily about wanting to change the regime, but in situations like this, it has to be a cooperation between the state and between society to try and help, to try and address the needs of those most vulnerable in societies, particularly where, as Mohamed was talking about, there are no safety nets. I mentioned unemployment. I mean, I mentioned the need for economic stimulus packages to have businesses that are going out of are going bankrupt. But there are also other things like unemployment benefits. Most of our countries don't have unemployment benefits. People have seen their pensions disappear. So I think that there could be the creation and a push, perhaps creating public debates. I mean, there are different mechanisms one can use to try and open up the debate in terms of what is needed to be done for specific groups or specific to address particular vulnerabilities. But these are all short-term, mind you. When we're talking about COVID-19, the measures we're talking about, whether it's providing immediate food packages, cash transfers to most vulnerable families. This is just to help them tide over for the next 6 months. The real challenge is this recession is going to stay with us for at least a few years. This is the worst recession globally. That is, I think that I don't remember the numbers that the IMF put out, but I think they were talking about 20% contraction. It's a massive recession at the global level. And the region has been specifically hard hit. When Saudi Arabia starts increasing VAT, removing subsidies, among others, that gives you a sense of how hard hit this region has been. So I think we need to think a bit long term in terms of what are the longer term measures that also need to be put in place, not just in terms of just the here and now. I think we're out of time.
We are coming out of time. There is one final question that I really would like to pose because it's extremely important. So if we can be a very quick answer. The question is that both of you have talked about the lack of data that is available out there, especially in the Arab world, especially in places in conflict. Have any of the countries provided disaggregated data that would allow observers to detect whether responses to the pandemic have been equitable in the Arab world? Can you think of any countries that have been able to disseminate data on the topic?
Off the top of my head, honestly, I don't know. I haven't seen. I haven't really been following the data or to see how disaggregated it is. But there are. I mean, for whoever asked this question, ESCO has been monitoring the policy response, and they have on their website a page where they've been really monitoring the policy response of different countries. Whether this matches the needs, I'm not sure. Whether they're looking at, for example, vulnerable groups only, or if they're looking at spatial inequality and where some areas might be far more hit than others. And these are obviously, the question is more for countries that are not in conflict, because countries in conflict, zero information, literally zero information.
Mohamed?
Yeah, very quickly, I can think of a couple of data sources that I've been using currently, working on COVID response and COVID impact and whatnot. And I think they are UNDP and European Commission funded, respectively. One is called ACAPS, ACAPS, which follows government measures. And they try to break down the data even by sub-regional governments. So in a country like Yemen, for instance, they will sort of try to have data on what's happening in the Houthi areas and what's happening in the Abdullah areas. So ACAPS is one, and then Inform is another project that does a decent job at sort of breaking down a lot of data that is relevant to this crisis. But beyond that, governments themselves publishing data is usually not very good. But these are two sources that I recommend.
Wonderful. Well, great. Because of time, we aren't able to address all of the questions, but thank you very much, both Maha and Mohamed, for truly an enlightening and educational, informative discussion. And I would like to thank our audience from joining in. I also would like to again remind our audience about our upcoming special webinar on racism and inequality, which will take place this coming Friday, June 12th at 1 p.m. EDT, 8 p.m. KSA. So you can go to the MIT Arab Alumni Association pages and register, and we hope to see you then. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you so
much.
much.
Thank you, Dana.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, MIT alumni.
Thanks for joining us. And for more information on how to connect with the MIT Alumni Association, please visit our website.